Before we get started, I want to once again remind you of our upcoming evangelism workshop that will be next Friday night and Saturday morning, and want to encourage every one of you to come. Now, I know Friday nights and Saturday mornings sometimes can be difficult times for us. People say, Saturday morning, that's the day I get to sleep in. That's the day I got to get things done. But, we oftentimes have things that come up, and we, if the Razorbacks are playing early game, we get up and head over there. If it's hunting season, we can get out of bed and do that. And when it's time for the Lord's people to meet and to work, we should also be willing to sacrifice some time to do that. We'll get you done before the afternoon, so if you've got things you got to take care of, just put them off till after 1, and we can get done with that. But we want everyone that can possibly be here to come to work and to prepare ourselves so that we can be prepared to give an answer, so that we can help others to know how and what the Bible teaches them to do. And we want to encourage you to make sure to put an effort into coming Friday and Saturday, especially Saturday morning for that workshop, and make sure that you make the time to be there. We have been looking at this month the book of 2 Samuel and the life of David. And when you get down to it, you realize that David was no angel. David did things and said things and acted in certain ways that we can find judgment with. David was a man of violence and a man of war. He was responsible for flat-out murder in cases. He overlooked sins that he should have punished. He did things that you look at and say, he shouldn't have done those things. But when you consider the worst thing David did, at least for his people, it might have been the census. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 15, it says that 70,000 men of the people died as a result of David choosing to number the people. What could be so bad about that? This morning our scripture reading came from 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verses 1 through 3, when it tells us that David decided, because of the anger of the Lord had burned against him, and David made the decision to number the people. Now, this year is a census year, right? We're going to have a census in the United States of America. I remember last year, I got a letter from the government that was saying, encourage people to be part of the census. And I'm like, they're telling me to preach a lesson on the census? What am I supposed to do about that? But what it is that they know how important it is that we have a census, right? It determines representation. All these political things come about because they got to know how many people are and where they live. We think of a census maybe as an annoying thing, right? But not necessarily a sinful thing. So why was it David was a sinful thing? Because it tells us because the anger of the Lord burned against David. You see, God was mad and there was an undercurrent. Now, some people have questioned this because in the parallel of this passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1, it tells us that Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. And some people say, well, wait, it says God did in 2 Samuel, but Satan did. Well, the answer is rather simple. You see, God's anger was against Israel. He was against what David was doing. And he uses Satan as the means to have this be brought to light. You see, the problem wasn't the fact that David was going to count the people. There were times when God commanded that to happen. I mean, the book of Numbers starts because they're numbering the people. The problem, though, was there was an undercurrent with David and his attitude and the people and their attitude. You know why it was seen as a problem? All you have to do is ask Job. In that scripture reading, we see Job say, may the Lord add to your people, but why would the king delight in such a thing? He says to David, yeah, we want to have as many people as possible. Yeah, but why are you doing this? He says the eyes of the Lord may add while the eyes of the Lord may still see. It's an interesting phrase he uses there. It's kind of akin, maybe we might say something like somebody's eyes are too big for their stomach. Why are you wanting this? This isn't really the thing you should be doing, David. Joab knew it was sinful. He knew it was a mistake. Excuse me, but in this instance, David wasn't thinking clearly. Because David, it was a point of pride. For Joab, he knew in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 6, that the king's command was abhorrent. It was wrong, right? He recognized how bad that it was. But see, David didn't see it in himself. David had in mind to see how big things had become. He wanted to see just how prosperous his kingdom was. He had fallen to one of those classic sins in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16. For in all that is from the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world. You see, that lust of the eyes, that pride of life, that desire to look out and say, I want to be successful, I want to have more, I want to be the best, I want to increase, and to do so because it makes us feel good about ourselves. It's funny how sometimes we can become obsessed with numbers. Athletes want to know that they're the highest paid player. They have the best records. People do that in other aspects in business and everything. We even do it in the church. I remember when I was a youth minister, people would always ask me, they say, you're a youth minister, they'd always ask me the follow-up question, how big is your youth group? And I always thought that was a funny question because, the youth group is made up of the families of the church. I'm not making those kids, right? They're there. I'm working with them. But everybody would always ask that. And I began to realize the reason they were asking that is what they were asking me is, well, how good are you at youth ministry? Because if you got a lot of kids, you must be pretty good, right? People say that, how big is your congregation? Because the idea is, if it's a lot of number, then you must be really good. But that's not always true. You can have a building full of people. The congregation can be doing really poorly. Numbers aren't always the most important thing. But yet we look at those because they're a source of pride. Well, there's a lot of people here. A lot of people can be gathered to do something that's not good. We become obsessed with that numbers. We think that that's significant. Well, there's a lot of folks, so things must be going well. But David had that idea, my people are great, but to God, he saw it as a problem. He's angry with them because their focus wasn't in the right place. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 17 tells us that he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. For it is not he who commends himself that is approved, but he whom the Lord commends. You see, our source of pride shouldn't come from ourselves. That's usually what we're concerned with. Do I feel accomplished? Let me see what I've done. But that kind of thinking doesn't always fit with what God is thinking. We can sit here and say, we've done great things. We're doing wonderfully. But the question is what does God think? It's not him who commends himself that is approved, but who the Lord commends. See, what's most important is not that everybody's happy. Not most important is there's a lot of folks engaged. The question we must ask ourselves is the Lord pleased with what we're doing? Or what we're doing, is it what the Lord wants us to be doing? See, David thought that if his kingdom was prospering, it was because he had done so much. But David knew better than that. His kingdom had prospered because of God. And when David's focus became on himself instead of God, David was sinning. He recognizes that later in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 10, when he says his heart troubled after him, after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted foolishly. The problem is David didn't recognize what he had done till after he had done it. He didn't see the sin until it was already there. Earlier I said of David's things that he did wrong, this may be the worst, and I counted it because of how many people were affected by it. But when we talk about sin, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a big sin to the world or a little sin to the world, whether it has huge consequences or small consequences. Sin in the end is always reprehensible before God. All sin leads to death. But there is such a thing as a worse sin. And what I mean by that is there are certain sins that we see them and we know we did them and we have to do something about them. But the worst sins are the ones that are the hardest to see. See, pride is one of those sins. You see, if it hadn't been for the census, David may not have even noticed that his pride was affecting him, right? If it wasn't for God using Satan to entice him to do this act, David might not have ever even seen that he was doing something wrong. Because pride would be one of those internal things that we don't see, and that's the most dangerous sin that we have, is the sin that we don't recognize that we have. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 18 through 21 tells us, "Let no man deceive himself. If any man of you thinks he is wise in this age, he must become foolish, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness before God, as it is written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, and that they are useless. So then let no one boast in men." You see, here the passage is telling us, don't fool yourself. Don't think that you're so smart and you're so wise that you have it all figured out, because it's that kind of state that leads you opposite of God. You see, that prideful existence where we think we have it all figured out and we know what's best is the one that can be the most damaging sin. Because rather than recognizing our state and turning to God, we think we can do it. We think that we can handle it, and in the end it leads to ruin. You know, one of the saddest stories in American history is that of Howard Hughes. If you don't know who Howard Hughes was, he was one of the richest men of his time. He was a top aviation designer. He dated famous movie actresses. He owned his own hotel line. He had his own airline. If he wanted to do it, Howard Hughes was able to do it. He was a man who had made himself come up from nothing and had made this gigantic empire. He made movies. He dated starlets. He was the, we think of Tony Stark. That was that character was made by Howard Hughes, a guy who had it all. But Howard Hughes ended up a crazy recluse. He had a series of mental breakdowns, and it caused him to withdraw from society. He would live in his hotels watching the same movie over and over. His fingernail and hairs grew out until he looked like more of an animal than a man. He refused to be around people because he was so afraid of germs. He was a drug addict so bad that when he died, his body was found to contain broken hypodermic needles under his skin because he couldn't even tell what had happened. He had taken so many drugs. He died of a heart condition that his own company had built a device that could have saved him. It was a terrible way for him to go. So what drove a man that could do so many great things to that existence? Well, a lot of people think it came from the fact that Howard Hughes could never be the richest man in the world. That was his goal. That was his desire. He wanted to be on top. He wanted that great number. Unfortunately, the couple of families above him had inherited their wealth. And at a certain point where you have so much money, it makes money so fast, it just builds up. And no matter what Howard Hughes could do, he could never reach that pinnacle. And it drove him insane. It drove him because he was chasing after that point of pride, right? He could have everything. But it never worked out for him. And it drove him to a sad and pathetic existence. See, pride will do that to you. If you think you can do it, if you rely on yourself, if you say, well, I can handle it, I'm the one, I'm the best, you will be humbled. See, David looked at his people and he thought, look at what I've done. But his pride was the problem. And his pride hurt him. But his pride, that sin, hurt others as well. See, after David does this, he goes to God recognizing he's done wrong. And he asks God to forgive him, but God says there's going to be a punishment. And he allows David a choice of his punishment. He gives him several options. And in the end, David in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 14 chooses the one that would put him in the hands of God. He says, I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. See, David didn't want to be like he was when he was younger, chased by an enemy, put into exile. He didn't want that. He said, if I'm going to be punished, I want God's hand to be on the punishment so that God will have mercy. And so God does that, and he sends this plague, the one that we referenced that killed so many on his people. Because you see, sin has consequences. David saw that later in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 17. He spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people, and he said, "Behold, it is I who have sinned, and I who have done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand be against me and against my father's house." You see, when David looks out and sees his people suffering because of what he did, he tells God that don't do that. Let it come against me. David recognizes that he was the one at fault. The sin, that it should fall to him. But you know what? Unfortunately, that's not the way sin works. You see, sin comes at a cost. It's damaging. And we may think a sin that's internal, like pride, only hurts us. But it never stays put. It affects others. And that's why we said it's so bad. Because we may not see it, but we definitely can see the consequences of it, not just to us, but those that are around us. See, sin hurts others. And sometimes we see that in our world. We see those whose bad choices, bad decisions, how they affect their family, their children, the church. How sin that we think is our own and should be no one else's business still has a way of bringing ruin and harm to others. You see, David may have thought that it was no big deal to number the people, but it was his pride at work. And his pride not only brought ruin to him, but to his people. You see, sin always hurts others as well as ourselves, and sin always comes at a cost. This incident ends in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verses 18 through 24. When David is seeing the angel that has gone, and he prays to God that the sin will be against him, and God stops it. And he does so at the threshing floor of Anera the Jebusite. You know, we see that sometimes how a disease is moving across the country and then finally it stops at a place. Well, this stopped at this man's house. In verse 19 it says, David went up according to the word of the Lord, just as the Lord had commanded him. As Araunah saw him coming, and his servants crossing towards him, and he went out and bowed his face to the ground before the king. And he said, "Why has my Lord come to his servant?" And David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be held back from his people." Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take the offer, what is good in his sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, the yokes of the oxen for wood. Everything, O king, Araunah gives to you. May the Lord God accept you." However, the king said, "No, I will surely buy it for you at a price. For I will not earn burnt offerings to the Lord, which cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. See, when David arrives there, this man who wants to serve his king says, "I will give you everything you need in order to build this altar. I'll give you the wood, I'll give you the animals. You don't have to pay anything, David." But David said, no, that's not how this works. David recognized that it was his fault this was all happening. And he said, "I'm not going to try to make up for it and not pay for it. I can't worship, I can't do if it doesn't cost me anything. I will not offer burnt offerings which cost me nothing." You know, those that don't ever have to pay for anything never understand the cost. Sometimes we see that, a kid that grows up and they've always had everything, their parents have paid for everything, and they get out into the real world and they go, "Wow, this is hard, right?" Comes at a cost because they've never had to pay it. David didn't want to be that way when he took his sin before the Lord. He didn't want to come and say, "Well, it didn't cost me anything." Because if it didn't cost him anything, it wouldn't mean anything to him. That may say something about how casual we approach sin, right? When we think of sin as being not really that significant, not that important, when we dismiss it. Pride is that way. We look at it as a sin. We say, "Oh, well, what's that harm?" David knew how much it harmed. David saw the consequences of it. God had shown him a vivid example of what happens when we think of ourselves more highly than we ought. When we put ourselves on the throne and think that it's because of us. David didn't want to make that mistake of not realizing the cost. And I think it's important that we do the same. You see, because our sin didn't cost us. And it should. Because sin always comes at a price. But the price was paid for us. And we need to recognize that. It's almost as if God would have a good idea if weekly He had to remind us of exactly how much our sin cost us. So that we wouldn't fall prey to thinking it's no big deal. That if He could somehow remind us each and every week of what sin cost, that might be good for us, huh? You see, in Him, Ephesians 1:7 tells us that we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of trespass, according to the riches of His grace. See, sin always comes at a cost. Someone has to pay. And Christ is the one who paid for us because of the riches of His grace. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 18 through 19, knowing this, you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile way of life inherited by your forefathers, but with the precious blood as a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. The worst sin is the one that we don't recognize that we have. The worst sin is the one that we don't see that the consequences affect not just us but everyone. The worst sin is the one that we don't realize the cost that was paid for it. You see, the reason David's census was so problematic is it sets forth an example to us to not make the same mistake that he did. To not make that mistake of thinking that we are the one, that we're the best. Become focused on our own accomplishments and our own lives and forget what was done for us. Sin comes at a cost. We weren't redeemed with something unworthy. We were redeemed with something that cannot be bought. Something far greater than silver and gold. A sacrifice that was made to save us from our sin. We need to remember what Jesus did for us. It's important that we don't make the same mistake David did of counting all that we have and forgetting the one who provided it for us. When we think about what we have, what God has blessed us with, when we think about what God has done for us, it shouldn't make us proud in ourselves, but grateful to God. See, that's why it's the ultimate foolishness to think that we could save ourselves by any other means than what God gave us. The sacrifice of Jesus was the only thing that could obtain the forgiveness of sin. We cannot do enough good things to think that we have earned ourselves a place with God. But we can listen and obey. And we can pay the price that God has given us to pay, not for the redemptions of sins, but the gratefulness that is shown in obedient service to Him. A truly thankful people understand what God has done for them and knows that we should listen and obey Him because of what He has done. Today I ask the question, are your sins taken care of? You're trying to think that this life is about what you make and the accomplishments that you have, and you think that will bring meaning, because it won't. Because all those things at the end of time will be meaningless. They'll all pass away. They'll all be burned up. But what will truly matter is the state that you have with God. As a Christian, are you serving yourself or are you serving your King? Are you making the mistake of thinking, well, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm right, when in fact there's something hidden, something that's destroying you, a sin that's eating away, that's affecting you and all those that are around you? Isn't it time to make a change? Isn't it time to set what's right? Think of what Jesus has done for you. Think of the cost that was paid. If He's done so much for us, can't we do what He's asked us to do? Today, if you need to submit yourself to the sacrifice that Jesus made, to have the blood of Jesus wash over you in the watery grave of baptism, or maybe as a Christian, you found yourself in a state that isn't right. Maybe like David, you realize what I have done isn't right, and I need to make a change. We offer you a chance to make that need known if you'll come while we stand and sing.